As noted, my name is Tracy. My husband's name is Brent, and I can't say enough, my thanks to Brent for his support in just walking with me. We've been married now for 25 years. We've celebrated our 25th anniversary on October last year, last year. And to celebrate that, we went on a cruise, and just my appreciation for the man who stood beside me and walked with me through a lot of the healing that I'm going to talk about. So the map, unfortunately, the picture quality lost some of its detail when I transferred it onto the PowerPoint, but Brent's going to direct you to, so where my ancestors come from originally is a remote northern Ontario village called Mammamatawa, and it's located on the Kanagami River. Can you point with your little thing, Brent? Do you remember? You're going to see a little arrow. Oops, go back. So that Hearst is right where his arrow is now, but if he goes left on the map, that's Highway 11. So Constance Lake is just right to the arrow, and Kanagami River is even further north, up further, Brent. Further, a little bit further. So it's around there. You kind of lose some of the picture quality. But Mammamatawa is actually, there was designated an Indian reserve called English River First Nation, or it was called English River Indian Reserve number 66. And it was actually quite swampy and uninhabitable, so they ended up moving to Mammamatawa on the Kanagami River. And it's about 60 miles north of the Canadian National Rail line, and it's between James Bay and Lake Nipigon, sorry. And it was only accessible by canoe in the spring and the summer. Oh, go back, not yet. Oh, just stay there for now. So it was only accessible by canoe in the spring and the summer, and in the winter months they traveled by snowshoe, dog sled, that kind of thing. And it was in the 1930s, it was home to about 20 families. And most people didn't live there year round, which is typical of First Nations tribes. What they usually do is in the winter, they spend their time more inland on their trapping hunting ground, and then they live in camps along the river in the spring and summer months, because they typically live off the land. So they just follow the food source throughout the seasons. And my nerves will calm down as I get going. So the next slide, you'll see my grandmother preparing some fur. These are beaver hides. And as I said, they typically trapped in the winter, and they trapped and prepared the fur. And they lived off of the meat. And I remember being so mesmerized by my grandfather or grandparents as they skinned the hide very carefully off of the animals. And even the moose hide was quite a process in getting the moose hide prepared, stretching it out and tanning it and smoking it to give it that nice smell. And the little money that they did earn, if you go to the next slide, you'll see another picture of my little brother is the smaller one, and my cousin Chad, and they're just, lifting up the beaver there. And on the bottom, you'll see two other hides. Those are marten hides that my grandmother also prepared. So she worked with all kinds of different fur. And the little money that they earned, they took to the Hudson's Bay Company. So if you go to the next slide, Brent. So in Mammamatawa, there was a Hudson's Bay post, and they would bring their fur in, and that's what the Hudson's Bay did. They did a fur trade. And so the money that they made with the fur, they would use to buy staples like tea, flour, oatmeal, some clothing, some hunting and trapping gear. And so it was just very basic necessities, really. So the conditions in Northern Ontario, as you could imagine, is quite cold in the winter and bug infested in the warmer months. And as a child, if you go to the next screen, Brent, as a child, so that's me in the red sleeve shirt, my cousin Chad in the middle, and my brother on the other side. As a child, I didn't know that my life was any different than any other child. I attended kindergarten in grade 1 in the little village that I grew up in, because eventually the families migrated from Mammamatawa it moved to Pagwashin River because the Hudson's Bay Post moved there. And incidentally, Chris, a friend of ours, there was an Army or Air Force stationed in Pagwashin River. So it was actually quite a commercial, at the time, it was quite a bustling little community for a northern community. So as a child, like I said, and then they moved, they actually changed the location of the reservation from Mammamatawa, and they moved it to a place called Constance Lake, just outside of Hearst, Ontario. So that's where I grew up. And I attended a little school, kindergarten, grade 1, right on the reservation. And then it was in grade 2 that we were all bused in to the community of Hearst, which is 30 kilometers from Constance Lake. And it was there that I first started to rub shoulders with the kids that were in Hearst, Ontario. And like I said, I didn't really think that there was any difference between me and the kids that I attended school with. To me, we played the same, we were in the classroom, and we just rubbed shoulders. And actually, where I started to notice the difference between myself and the kids that I went to school with is in listening to how they talked about their families. So I can recall we had a checkers showdown, like, the board game checkers. And there was a girl, probably grade 5, there was a girl who was really good at strategizing on the checkers board, and I thought I was a pretty good checker player. So when it came to coming up against her and playing checkers, she beat me. And I was really surprised, but then it was her comment afterwards that really left an impression with me. That was kind of the first time that I started to realize, hey, things are a little bit different here. She said, I'm really good at playing checkers because my dad taught me how to play. And that really left an impression on me, because I was like, wow, you play checkers with your dad? And I didn't have a dad, I had a mushum. My mushum is my grandfather in Cree. And I called him though, my papa, because ever since I was wee, my grandparents raised me. So to hear someone in my classroom speak about their father in that way, like in such like a playful way, and it was an endearing kind of comment that she made, it was really quite a surprise. And in order for you to understand why I would have such a reaction, I'm going to take you on a journey. It's a journey that I hope will give you a glimpse into one family of Aboriginal descent, but in the bigger picture, I hope that you'll be able to understand some of the complexities regarding First Nations issues and why many people are discovering now that it's not a quick fix. So First Nations people, they lived by collective wisdom, skills drawn through many generations. They're hunters, they're gatherers, they're craftspeople, they're jokesters, and they're storytellers. And if you go to the next slide, stories are our means of passing down knowledge, wisdom, cultural traditions from one generation to the next. Parents and grandparents and the community taught their children about nature and how to get along with family. Playtime was always teaching time. Boys hunted and fished with their older brothers, their uncles, the fathers, grandparents. The girls tended to stay closer to home, and I can often remember going on trips with my grandmother to gather water, gather wood. She was constantly sewing, and she would do, very basic food preparation. So this is why it was so devastating for the Aboriginal people when the Canadian government passed laws that would govern how they would handle the Indian problem. So why were Indians considered a problem? They were a problem because Sir John A. Macdonald and his government saw the First Nations people and Métis as barriers to the Confederation and the railway. So they sought to remove the Indigenous nations and their lands from their lands and eliminate their way of life. So they got busy enacting legislation. So if you go to the next screen, Brent, first came the Gradual Civilization Act in 1872. And what this encouraged was any man over the age of 21 who could read, write, speak English or French in some form, they could be enfranchised. And although this might sound inclusive, it meant that they were no longer deemed Indian, and they became British subjects. So after that legislation came the Dominion Lands Act in 1872. And what this encouraged, and I'm being really brief here, not a lot of time to get into them, but I'm just giving a little snapshot. So what this legislation did is it encouraged white settlement in the prairies by giving away Indigenous land to the settlers. So based on this legislation, the Indian Act was introduced in 1876, and it authorized the government to define Indians and their rights. So Sir John A. Macdonald also amended that act to ban cultural ceremonies such as potlatches and the Sundance because they were scary and they posed a threat to the settlers. So essentially what happened as our country was being established was cultural genocide and land theft. So settlers came to North America, it was already inhabited, and in order to forge a way in this vast country, something needed to be done, hence legislation. So Sir John A. was responsible for implementing what is called, hang on a second here, he implemented a policy of forced assimilation, AKA the residential school system. So if you go to the next slide, Brent, yep. So in 1883, Sir John A. authorized the creation of 130 residential schools across Canada, and in total, 150,000 First Nations, Inuit, Métis children were moved from their families. They were forced to attend by law these institutions. So separated from their families, they were punished for speaking their language, punished for practicing culture, and the vast majority experienced neglect and abuse, and thousands died. So this is an image of the Pelican Lake Indian Residential School, and it's just outside of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. This school was operated by the Catholic Church, run by nuns and priests, and there was a great effort at this time to convert Aboriginals to Christianity. So children were rounded up by authorities, put on a train, and sent far from home. So attending this residential school, this is where I believe this school changed the man that I know could have, what he could have become, my grandfather. So next slide. So you'll see here, this is a picture of a whole bunch of First Nations boys dressed in suits. So this was, part of the intent of these schools, and this is a quote, "to kill the Indian and save the man." So I witnessed my grandfather's work ethic when I was a child. He was a hard-working man. He provided well for his family, but there was a scar, a very deep emotional wound, one that crushed his spirit. And incidentally, he would never set foot in a church again after leaving the school, except for funerals and his children's weddings. So our spirit is where our true identity resides. If you go to the next slide. And because this is the part of us that communes with God, I love Psalm 139, because in Psalm 139, the psalmist says that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, that it was God who knit us together in our mother's wombs, and he saw our unformed bodies. It is here that God is putting his special touches in our lives. It's here that he determines whether we're going to be a boy or a girl. He determines our personality. He determines whether we'll use our left hand or right hand. He is the one who's shaping us here. And this, I just love the message that this psalmist, it just displays and it just really evokes intimacy with us, that God's Spirit is knitting us together in our mother's womb. He's actively creating everyone in the womb. And that's his gift to us. It's our true identity. So in light of that scripture and everything that makes us who we are as individuals was stripped away from my grandfather in the residential schools. His name was changed. The only language he ever knew was forbidden. And any cultural practices that would have been familiar to bring the children comfort was absolutely denied. So in order to make the children comply, harsh punishment was used. There were also accounts of sexual abuse in these schools, to which my grandfather confessed in his older years. He experienced himself during his time at the residential school. And to make matters even worse for him, his mom died while giving birth when he was a young boy. His father remarried another woman not long after that to care for his family, help care for his family. And the woman that he married didn't really take to him and his brother. And then only a few years after he remarried, my great-grandfather also died. His father also died in an accident. So both parents gone. The place where he might have received comfort for being able to endure his experience at the residential school was no longer available. If you go to the next slide, Mother Teresa, who was well known for working with orphans and the poor in Calcutta, said, "There's no deeper wound than that of not being loved." So after leaving the residential school, my grandfather eventually met and he married my grandmother, and they had 12 children. My mom was one of them. My grandfather was never able to express to his family what happened or what was happening on the inside of his spirit. He learned to cope by turning to alcohol, which is what many of them did. Here is where the residual effect of my grandfather's experience got passed down to the next generation. So instead of passing down language, knowledge, wisdom, culture, he raised his kids based on what was modeled to him. He was not given affection. He didn't give affection. He was abused as a means of discipline, so he used strict physical discipline. And when he drank, anger reared its ugly head. And in my own healing, I've discovered that anger is actually a stage of grief. If we have unresolved grief, we can actually remain stuck in this phase of anger or anguish. And it wasn't until I was 18 years old that I discovered my grandparents' story, particularly my grandfather. He never really spoke it from his mouth, but I got home from school that first year, and he handed me a newspaper article. The whole articles throughout this newspaper up north was published, and in it was the account and the history of the residential schools. Up to that point, my grandparents never talked about their experience. So it was until 18 years old that it really started to come to light for our family. And there was so much shame because of the abuse, both physical and sexual abuse, that it was rarely talked about in our family and in other families in the community. Secrets and shame shaped my grandparents. The main message is that they heard was, "You don't matter." But even after discovering what happened to them, I had no idea how their story would answer a lot of questions in my own story. My grandparents were never parented. They were removed from the ones that could parent them, who could love them and speak blessing into their lives. And instead, they lived in a cold, sterile environment with the message drilled into them with harsh punishment. It's not okay to be you. So if you look, the next image is an image of a tree. And you can't really see the words there, but I chose this image because of the messages that kind of were deeply embedded in them. They're like roots. And the messages that they received and they heard defined so much of the behavior. The message, the main message being, "I don't matter." So there's, a root of rejection. There's a root of loneliness. There's a root of bitterness. And from that, you see at the top, there isn't really much good fruit up there. So the root and the message has a long arm, and it stretches way back in our family history. So messages that my grandparents received about themselves that they in turn passed on to their children and their children. So this home environment was where my mother was raised. So if you show the next slide. There's a picture of my mom when she was a young woman, and she's sitting by the Pagwashan Bridge there where she would have grown up primarily. Her spirit was crushed. I just need a drink of water. So her spirit was crushed by the man who should have been there to protect her, her own father. So as a young girl, she was always trying to convince my grandmother to leave, because my grandmother bore the brunt of my grandfather's anger. My mother eventually left home when she was 15, and in time she would meet and she would marry my father. But it was a marriage brought about because she found herself pregnant with me, something that neither my father or my mother was planning. So my parents, they weren't in a serious relationship at the time that it happened, and my father tried to do the right thing by marrying my mother. But my mother readily admits that she did not love him. And actually, my mother was never really able to give her heart fully to one person. After a short marriage, my mother decided that she couldn't be with the man that she didn't love. So she left with me as an infant and moved back to the community where she came from, back to the home that she ran from when she was a young teenage girl, and one that she would eventually run from again, but this time without me. So I believe that this is when my spirit was crushed. When my mother abandoned me, a root of abandonment grew in me. And this is where the message seeped into me that has that long generational arm, that I don't matter. I was left with my grandparents who raised me, and I grew up witnessing many violent acts by my grandfather, and this was my model for a father, which is my reaction. Do you remember when I told you about the checkers and the girl talking about her father? This was my model. I was afraid of my grandfather. So as a result, I hid. I went inside myself, I hid. And my true identity, I was hiding. So the roots of abandonment, rejection, traumatic experiences bore the fruit that I walked out of for a lot of years. So even after coming to faith in Christ, I still believed the messages which were deeply rooted in me, that it was not good to be Native. I wanted nothing to do with that part of my heritage. I developed, when I was about 12 years old, I developed an eating disorder. It was a pattern of eating because I didn't know where to turn. And then I would purge to get rid of the junk. And I see now that this eating disorder, I no longer have it, but this eating disorder in my life was an outward metaphor. It was like a physical display for what I desperately wanted on the inside, and that was comfort. But there's good news. God did rescue me, and only God could orchestrate the details of our lives to come to this. Wow, what an opportunity to be able to share my story. The Lord showed me that I was carrying unforgiveness, and I started to recognize some bitter roots that went pretty deep toward my mother, and it was preventing me from going deeper in my relationship with Jesus. So not long after making a choice, it is a choice to forgive. A passage of scripture that I had read many, many times came to life, and it spoke to me in a very personal way. And if you go to the next slide, and it's this verse here. But to all who did receive him, to all who believed in his name, Jesus, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. It was here, after I forgave, after I chose to forgive, I heard those words, and I said to myself, I am accepted. So going back to forgive, I'm not going to lie, it's painful. But the results bring joy. I believe that in order for our nation, our people to heal from the pain of the past, the first step toward healing is forgiveness. Forgiveness is the doorway to healing. I know this from personal experience. The federal government did eventually apologize for the residential schools in June 2008. You can go online and you can see the apology that Stephen Harper made to the First Nations people. However, later, the government refused to provide thousands of documents that would allow the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to do its work. So when an apology is not followed up in good faith, there's a lack of trust there. It loses its power to enable the work to happen, the next steps to happen. But the Truth and Reconciliation Commission opened the door for many people to come forward, to tell their stories. It gave them a platform to confess their hurts. It started the journey toward healing for many people. And to look ahead, look straight on at the unresolved grief that so many of them still harbor. They're stuck there. So forgive those who hurt. Step into our true identity that God put together himself. One that God sees as highly valued, deeply cherished, most of all, loved. And I believe that when the wounded spirit is healed, we will once again connect to the Creator and worship him in spirit and in truth. I know that we're going to move on to a hymn called Great is Thy Faithfulness, and I was privileged to be able to pick that hymn. And I think it's really fitting because he is faithful. He is the one that's led this way, and he is the one that has prompted us to forgive. He's the one that's going to heal our spirit, and he's the one that's going to draw us back to himself. Thank you for listening.